A sadness hung in the air as the little boy's parents sat in the principal's office. Hours had passed since he'd gone missing, and they had looked everywhere. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. The officer couldn't hide the sadness in his eyes. With every passing hour, their chances of finding him were becoming slimmer. But just then, the phone rang. The situation was about to get a lot worse. It was supposed to be a good day. When little Daniel's parents woke him up for school that morning, he was in high spirits. It was supposed to be just another Monday morning. But just an hour after the little boy's dad dropped him off at school, he received a call from the principal. Daniel was gone, and no one knew what had happened to him. News spread fast. Everyone in town knew about the missing 6-year-old child. The case was reported to the police, and the search started immediately. But no one could understand how the little boy had gotten out of school grounds. Daniel's parents were sick with worry. They had driven to every corner of town, but he was nowhere to be found. After hours of searching, the concerned parents found themselves in the principal's office, waiting for answers. Police and neighbors had flocked the streets, searching high and low for the little boy. But it all seemed hopeless. Hours had passed, and no one had a clue where he could have gone. In the span of an hour, he had disappeared. Terrible thoughts crossed his parents' minds. Something happened to their son, and they feared the possibilities. Anger coursed through their veins. They had trusted the school to keep their child safe. But now, he was gone. The man placed a shaky hand on his distressed wife's thigh, trying desperately to soothe her. All they could do now was wait. The lead detective for their son's case stood in the corner of the room, deep in thought. None of it made sense. How could a young child simply vanish from school grounds without a single other person noticing? The officer had dealt with cases like these before, and sadly, they never ended the way he wanted them to. The streets had grown cold and windy. The sun was hidden behind dark gray clouds, threatening to spill at any moment. A storm was brewing, and they were running out of time. Neighbors and strangers worked together as they flooded the streets in search of the boy. Everyone in town had received the news that a 6-year-old boy had gone missing, including 42-year-old Shauna Oswald, who was about to make a sinister discovery. Amy and Martin Gray had always dreamed of starting their own family. When their son Daniel was born, their lives instantly changed for the better. The day he was welcomed into the world was the happiest day of their lives. They swore to protect him at all costs, but they had no idea what tragedy would follow just 6 years later. Daniel was just 2 years old when his parents decided to move to a new neighborhood in Houston, Texas. The move was calculated. They wanted to send their son to one of the best schools in town. They were committed to giving him the best education possible. As the years passed, they watched their baby grow into a healthy and happy little boy. But nothing could prepare them for what would happen shortly after his 6th birthday. That weekend was nothing short of perfection. They had spent it at home, swimming and bonding with their son. Weather forecasts predicted terrible weather for the week ahead, and they wanted to make the most of sunny weather. Daniel was in high spirits, and they never could have predicted what would happen on that Monday morning. When Martin woke Daniel up for school that morning, the little boy was in high spirits. He loved his school, and he couldn't wait to tell his friends and teacher about his weekend. The 10-minute drive to school was no different from any other day, and when Daniel stepped out of his father's truck, everything seemed fine. Martin waved the boy off as he walked into the main entrance. Once he was sure that his child was safely inside the school grounds, he drove off. Martin would never be able to forget the phone call he received just an hour later. When the principal's name first appeared on his phone screen, he didn't think much of it. He assumed Daniel had forgotten one of his books, or maybe he had fallen ill. But then, the principal said something that sent shivers down the father's spine. "Mr. Gray, Daniel's gone. We can't find him anywhere." Martin and his wife Amy spent hours driving through town, searching for their little boy. A warning was sent out, and people from all over their city were on the lookout for the missing 6-year-old boy. As soon as the police were informed, search parties were sent out. But no one had a clue as to where the boy could have gone. "How could this happen? We trusted you to keep him safe." Martin was furious as the principal stood before him, his face twisted in distress. The lead detective for their son's case stood in the corner of the room, deep in thought. I don't know how something like this could have happened," the older man said, regret evident in his voice. Martin and Amy had looked everywhere for their child, but it was useless. They couldn't find him anywhere. A sadness hung in the air as the little boy's parents sat in the principal's office. Hours had passed since he'd gone missing, and they had looked everywhere. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. The officer couldn't hide the sadness in his eyes. With every passing hour, their chances of finding him were becoming slimmer. Terrible thoughts crossed his parents' minds. Something happened to their son, and they feared the possibilities. What if someone had taken him? What if he wasn't even in the same state anymore? The thought alone was enough to send a shiver down any parent's spine. But was it enough to bring the little boy home? Each second that passed felt like an eternity for the distraught couple. So many bad things had come to mind, and they knew that if the authorities couldn't find their son, no one could. Martin and Amy knew about the terrible things some people would do to children, and they were terrified for their little boy's safety. Amy felt like she was going to be sick. The couple knew that in a missing persons case, the first 24 hours were the most crucial. And so far, some of those hours have already passed. But the worst part was that the authorities had no clues. They had absolutely nothing to go on, and that complicated matters. Would they ever see their son again? Martin was pacing along the length of their couch as Amy sat on it. Tears were streaming down his wife's face, and there was nothing he could do about it. He felt just as bad as she did. Their little boy was gone, and all they could do was sit by and wait. He would be lying if he said it wasn't the worst waiting period he had ever experienced. But what else could they do? Yet another hour had passed, and Martin decided that he couldn't wait anymore. The least he could do was go out there himself. The school was 2 blocks away, and a 6-year-old couldn't have gone that far on his own. Or could he? The question still lingered in the back of the young father's mind. But that wasn't going to stop him. Would he be lucky? Martin went into his bedroom and grabbed a jacket. It was now or never, he told himself. But just as he was about to step out the door, his wife said something that had him freezing in his tracks. "This is really bad," she said as more tears began to roll down her cheeks. Martin turned to face her, and that was when he saw what she was talking about. Outside, the streets had grown cold and windy. The sun was hidden behind dark gray clouds, threatening to spill at any moment. A storm was brewing, and they were running out of time. That was when Martin knew that he couldn't do this on his own. He needed help, and a lot of it. But who would be willing to follow him into a storm? Martin sat down on his couch, his fingers working furiously as he began calling his family members and closest friends. There had to be some of them that would be willing to help him look for his son. Of course, a few of them refused to get caught up in the storm, but some agreed. As they made their way to his house, Martin decided to pull a few more strings. Martin called up all his neighbors with the hope that he could pull together a party large enough to cover every corner. Yes, There had already been an initial search around town, but that had been when the sun was still visible and the skies clear. With the changes in time and weather, there came even more danger for Martin's 6-year-old son. He'd need every bit of firepower he could find. With the help of his family, friends, and neighbors, Martin started forming teams. He assigned areas of the town to each group, hoping to cover as much ground as possible. Despite the impending storm, people showed up, determined to assist in any way they could. The starting point was Danny's school, which Martin had named Ground Zero. Everyone's solidarity brought a glimmer of hope to him and Amy in this dire situation. They felt the strength of their community rallying behind them. The wind began to howl, and raindrops started to fall as the search parties set out into the stormy weather. The streets of Houston became increasingly difficult to navigate, with visibility dropping to nearly zero. The rain was relentless, soaking everyone to the bone. Puddles overran the once dry streets, and the temperatures dropped exponentially. But the volunteers pressed on, driven by the urgency of finding Daniel and bringing him home safely. They refused to let the storm deter them from their mission. Amy couldn't sit still any longer. Despite her husband's plea for her to stay home, she decided to join the search. She wrapped herself in a raincoat, put on her boots, and stepped out into the tempestuous weather. She wouldn't sit safely at home when her little baby was out there suffering. She'd give her all to find and bring him home to safety. Her heart pounded with each step she took, calling out her son's name, hoping for a response. The relentless rain blurred her vision, but she trudged on, driven by a mother's unwavering love and determination. Hours seemed like days as the search parties scoured the city, but there was no sign of Daniel. The storm raged on, making it nearly impossible to hear or see anything beyond a few feet. The search parties started at Daniel's school and spread out in every direction. They tried to theorize where someone like Daniel would go and quickly headed to investigate. But despite their exhaustive efforts, the teams found no clues, no hints of where the young boy could be. The frustration and despair were palpable among the searchers, but they refused to give up hope. Martin blamed himself for what had happened to Daniel. He felt guilty for not being able to protect his son. He saw himself as a failure. How could he call himself a dad and husband when he couldn't protect those closest to him? As he continued to search through the torrential rain, his mind raced with what-ifs and regrets. Every puddle he stepped in, every gust of wind that whipped past him, intensified his guilt. He wished he could turn back time and prevent this nightmare from unfolding. Despite the challenges posed by the storm, the community continued to support the Grays in their search for Daniel. People opened their homes to the search parties, providing shelter, food, and warm drinks to keep them going. The community was truly rallying behind Martin and Amy. Neighbors who had never met the Grays joined the search, united in the mission to find the missing boy. The outpouring of support and kindness was overwhelming and gave the Grays a renewed sense of hope. Unbeknownst to the search parties, they were looking in the wrong place. Daniel had wandered off in a direction no one had thought to check. He had been fascinated by a new playground near the school and had ventured there on his own. After playing for a while, his curious mind had led him out of the playground and into the city. The storm had disoriented him, and he had lost his way back. Meanwhile, the search parties were combing areas far from where Daniel was actually located, wasting precious time and energy. Daniel, unaware of the commotion his disappearance had caused, was having an adventure of his own. The playground was deserted due to the storm. He enjoyed the feeling of being the king of his own little world, playing in the drier areas of the empty playground before eventually venturing off. He climbed on the equipment imagining himself as a brave explorer on a quest.
Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story.
As the hours passed, however, his excitement began to wane, and he started to feel cold and hungry. Late afternoon quickly approached, yet the storm refused to subside. The rain wouldn't stop, and the clouds wouldn't clear. Darkness and an overwhelming cold persisted, seemingly foreshadowing the truth about little Daniel. But even then, his parents wouldn't entertain the idea of never seeing him again. The search parties, exhausted and disheartened, continued their efforts despite the dwindling hope. Little did they know that the break in the storm would soon lead them to the discovery they had been desperately seeking. One of the search parties decided to check the playground near the school one last time. As they approached, they heard faint noises and discovered 2 squirrels digging around a school backpack. There was leftover fruit snacks in one of the bag's pockets, a clear indication that its owner had started eating before getting fed up and leaving it. Amy held back a whimper as she recognized the bag. It was her son's. She called out for him, but no answer came. The pitter-patter of raindrops is all she could hear. And that more than broke her heart. Martin had to call off the search for a few minutes so that everyone could regroup. He could see the toll in their eyes and, knowing that they were all doing him a favor, asked them to take a few minutes to breathe. He was glad that everyone had rallied to his call, dropping everything to help him and Amy find Daniel. But he knew he couldn't overwork them as he was doing. When this was done, he'd throw them a wonderful party as a thank you. He only hoped his son would be a part of the festivities. Martin had expected 5, 6 couples to come over and help with his search. But before long, his house had been packed with volunteers. Friends, family members, neighbors, and even strangers had come by to show their support and aid in the search. He'd wondered if such a great number would finally be enough to bring the little boy home. With hope coursing through his veins, Martin had explained his plan. He wanted each couple to take a street so they could cover every direction surrounding the school. He'd shown everyone a recent picture of his son, hoping it would help them locate the boy. And before long, they were standing in front of the school where the little boy went missing. Neighbors and strangers had worked together as they flooded the streets in search of the boy. They didn't care about the bad weather or the miles that lay ahead. All they wanted to do was find the kid and bring him home before the rain got worse. And, surprisingly, they weren't the only ones. With each hour that passed, more people had joined the search. Everyone in town had received the news that a 6-year-old boy had gone missing, including 42-year-old Shauna Oswald. The story touched the woman deeply, and she wished she could join the search. But sadly, duty called. Shauna was still on the clock for the next few hours, and she knew she'd be exhausted after that. So she said a prayer and continued her work, unaware of the crucial role she had to play in this case. Shauna Oswald didn't know the Gray family personally. The woman worked as a school bus driver in town, and that was as close as she would get to meeting the Gray boy. Or so she thought. On that particular morning, Shauna was simply going about her usual routine. She woke up early, got dressed, and started picking up the children who were waiting along her route. She had no idea the day would take such a turn. As Shauna drove her bus around town, she heard about Daniel's disappearance on the radio. The news instantly broke her heart. She could only imagine what his parents were going through. She wished she could help, especially when she saw the clouds coming in. But she couldn't do anything until she finished her shift. Or so she thought. Before Shauna knew it, hours had passed. She had dropped off all the children, and now she was waiting for the time to come to pick them up again. But the little boy that went missing still lingered on her mind. She wondered if someone had found him and returned him to his parents, or had something more sinister happened. But as the day progressed, Shauna did everything in her power to distract herself from the terrible news. She drove for hours on end, picking kids up and dropping them off at their different schools. By the time 3 p.m. rolled around, she had almost forgotten about the terrible news from that morning. But soon, she would be met with a horrifying sight. By that point, Shauna had already been on the road for 8 hours, and she could feel the exhaustion catching up with her. But at least she was almost done. Well, that was what she kept telling herself. But her day was nowhere near done, and she was about to find out why a few more hours would be added to her workday. It was 3:12 p.m., and Shauna was almost done with her shift. She just had one more stop in the center of town. 3 kids sat behind her, and when she stopped to let them off, she let out a relieved sigh. It had been a long day, and she couldn't wait to get home. She slowly began making her way down the road when she noticed something strange. In the distance, she noticed something odd. Cars were swerving and honking. People were slamming on their brakes. But from where she was sitting, she couldn't see a thing. Shauna assumed that a random deer had made its way into the middle of the road, and people were swerving and honking to avoid hitting it. She assumed it was nothing too serious, since no one was stopping and simply continued on their journeys. She had no idea how wrong she was. The interruption in the road created slow-moving traffic, but as Shauna inched closer, she squinted out at the road. She couldn't see anything. Why were people slamming on their brakes and honking? She tried to peek around the truck in front of her, but it was impossible to see what was in the middle of the road. But just then, the truck moved out of the way, and Shauna was met by a disturbing sight. As soon as Shauna's eyes landed on the road ahead, she slammed on the brakes. The road was wet from the rain that had been pouring down during the last few minutes, and she had to use all her training to stop her bus from spinning out of control. The bus skidded across the road and stopped mere inches from the disturbing sight that had her slamming on her brakes to begin with. Shauna took a moment to catch her breath, and then remembered why she was in this situation. To begin with, the second she saw the object in the road, she remembered what she had heard on the radio earlier that day. A shiver ran down her spine. She had to call the authorities right away. She dialed the 3-digit number and waited for an operator to answer. Her palms were sweaty, and her hands were shaking. Cars were speeding down the road and slamming on their brakes right before impact. Finally, someone answered the phone. 911. What's your emergency? The words left Shauna's mouth the second they answered. I found the missing boy. Once she had given the necessary information, the operator informed Shauna that help was on the way, but she couldn't wait for the police to get there. The boy was in severe danger as he walked through traffic alone. Shauna had to save him if it was the last thing she ever did. She stepped out of the bus, not caring if she got hurt. She had to protect the little 6-year-old boy. Shauna swung her arms in the air, shouting for the cars around her to stop. Luckily, they complied. Daniel was distressed and dazed in the middle of the road. It was clear that he was overwhelmed to the point where he struggled to move from where he was standing. "Little boy," Shauna shouted, "stay right there. I'm going to help you," she told him. The cars around them stopped moving, and Shauna was able to run out to where he stood. People watched with their jaws dropped as she snatched the boy from the middle of the road. Tears painted his cheeks. He was beyond terrified as Shauna walked him back to the bus. He was in safe hands, but now Shauna needed the police to take him to his parents. Martin and Amy had driven alongside the lead detective when he received the call from the operator. Daniel had been found in the middle of town, wandering the streets, all by himself. When they arrived on the scene, Shauna was on the bus with the boy on her lap, sobbing into her shoulder. Martin and Amy cried out to their boy as they ran toward him and Shauna. "You saved him! You saved our baby!" Amy cried as she picked the little boy up. He clung to his mother, still terrified but relieved to have his parents by his side. Martin didn't have words. He couldn't believe that a stranger had been brave enough to run into oncoming traffic just to save his little boy. He was astonished to find that people like Shauna existed. "I owe you my life," he told her, tears burning behind his eyes. Finally, after hours of searching, Daniel was back home, safe. It turned out that one of the groundskeepers at his school had left a gate open, and Daniel decided to explore the streets around his school. Soon enough, the little boy was lost. The school posted a formal apology on its website, and the principal shared his sorrow with the parents. The old man was so mortified, and Martin knew that he would never allow something like this to happen ever again. But at the end of the day, he was just relieved that his son was okay. That's all that mattered. He would forever be grateful for the woman who saved him. After the shock of the moment had passed, the police arrived on the scene, along with an ambulance, to check on Daniel's condition. The officer in charge took down Shauna's statement, praising her bravery and quick thinking. Shauna, still trembling from the adrenaline and emotion of the moment, recounted the events leading up to her discovery of Daniel in the middle of the road. The police were amazed at her courage and efficiency, and the story of the bus driver who saved a little boy spread like wildfire through the town. The local news stations caught wind of the incident and wanted to interview Shauna. The story of a school bus driver who had gone above and beyond to save a child from potential disaster was heartwarming and inspiring. People from all over the town reached out to express their gratitude to Shauna. Some even wanted to reward her for her bravery. However, Shauna declined any personal rewards, saying she did what anyone in her position would do. She was only glad that Daniel made it home safely. The incident brought the community closer together. Everyone was talking about the little boy who had gone missing and the brave bus driver who had found him. The town organized a community event to celebrate Daniel's safe return and to honor Shauna's heroic act. The event was a grand affair. It was filled with music, speeches, and a special presentation to Shauna. Martin and Amy Gray, overwhelmed with gratitude, took the stage to personally thank Shauna for her selfless act. "Shauna, words cannot express the depth of our gratitude," Martin began, his voice trembling with emotion. "You risked your life to save our son. You are a true hero." Amy, holding Daniel close to her, added tearfully, "You brought our baby back to us. We will forever be in your debt." Shauna, visibly moved by the outpouring of love and support from the community, responded humbly. "I'm no hero," she said softly. "I did what any decent person would do. I'm just grateful that Daniel is safe and sound."